The neutral sign is the one thing that will come up your backside more often than anything else, and quite often people will put them in indiscriminately. They won't follow the rules. They'll put them in trying to remind you of something that you don't need to be reminded of, and it's like having a nagging person around all the time, nagging you so much to listen to them that you don't listen to anything. And so what happens is people use neutrals so indiscriminately and try to reset things that you know have gotten reset, that now every time I look at a neutral I have to ask myself, is it real or is it a liar? Is it true or is it Memorex?
Well, what's the double sharp symbol?
The double sharp symbol is when we want to have two sharps on something, we use an X. The original version was an X with 4 dots, double sharp. And for double flats, they still to this day use 2 flats on the thing.
Where'd that symbol come from?
What?
The
sharp symbol? You know, I looked it up on Wikipedia and nobody seems to know. It appeared around the 11th century. It appeared somewhere around the 11th century. Here's what I think. You take a Model T Ford, you bring it forward in today, and you look at a brand new car, and you try to take all the plumbing from the new car and stick it on the old Ford. What you're going to wind up with is a nightmare of plumbing. Instead of redesigning the car entirely, if you keep trying to modify it and readapt it so we can make it modern, you're going to wind up with a nightmare of plumbing. That is the story of music history. People invented something and it worked nicely for a while, and then 200 years later it didn't work anymore, so someone came up with an exception to the rule. Then the exception to the rule became the rule, and then that became the new tradition, then that was passed on, and then 250 years later people had problems doing something new, so they invented something else, and on and on and on. And that's what happened. Putting 2 sharps on the line, I guess, was too hard for people to see. So they invented a whole thing. With a flat, they didn't have a problem with that. So I'm not exactly sure why, but I do know that it was probably a committee decided on it, it became a tradition, it was passed on mindlessly thereafter, and the reason for doing it has been lost. So that doesn't mean that we have to keep those traditions, right? Anyway, time to go. I'm giving you homework, and if you come back in 3 weeks...
3 weeks?
Yeah, it'll be 3 weeks.
First week of August, first Wednesday
of August.
These are, hidden in there are melodies, and these are all melodies you know. They've all been written in different keys. And if you use this decoding that I told you about, the last flat to the right is always the number 4. The last sharp to the right is always, thank you, the number 7. The first 2, I've already shown you, everybody's got one? I've already shown you in the first 2 where the number 1 would land. The first one is E flat. The last flat is the number 4. If you count down, the bottom line happens to be where 1 is. The second staff down, you'll notice there's 4 sharps. Well, it just so happens that the 4th sharp is the number 7, and if you count down, the number 1 becomes the bottom line also. So although one would be E flat and the other is E, it turns out they both look exactly the same when you're doing it by number. We don't have to know it's E flat, we don't have to know it's E. We only have to know that that bottom line is 1. So this is the case where 2 different time signatures or key signatures share the same line. Share the same line. They would be read. And you'll find that when you get into reading by number, this out of the 12 keys, there's 2 keys that point to the same line, or 2 keys that point to the same space. So there's really only 6 things to learn. You only have to learn to read in 6 keys by number. And then what happens is just reverse it. Another thing is if I turn the paper over, upside down, any numbers that we learned for the bottom 3 lines would be exactly the same for the top 3 lines if they were turned over. They would look the same. In other words, if I take this interval, which is a third, and I turn it over, still a third, isn't it? If I take my 6th and I turn it over, still a 6th. It's just that here, top line, second to the bottom space, second to the bottom top space, bottom line. So if I learn to read this line, that space, that line, that space, and that line, I will have learned to read in every key. Because if I turn it over, same. Okay, let's back up. Now, on the first Wednesday of next month is when we meet again.